Many people aren't aware that Photoshop actually has the ability to create animations or small movies similar to what you might do in, say, After Effects, Premiere, or Apple Final Cut Pro. Now, those tools are dedicated strictly to video and they've got everything you need to do video really well. Photoshop is not quite on that level, but you will be surprised at what you can do, and there's an awful lot that you can accomplish with Photoshop's built-in video editing, especially when you're used to Photoshop. Now you can take a lot of the tools that you're familiar with, the techniques you're familiar with, begin using them in your animations, and even editing existing movies. So you can import, say, a QuickTime movie or an MP4, and right into Photoshop you can then add mask, you can do things with its opacity, you can do a lot of the things to video that you would do to a regular photo or an image. And that's what makes this kind of editing in Photoshop so great. So we're going to look at how this tool works, some of the foundational concepts about animations, and then we're going to look at some examples, some really neat examples that you can get up and going with a few cool examples, and then have enough knowledge and experience that you can go off and build some of your own. One of the main things is the timeline. This is where all the animations happen, and the timeline is basically our palette that we build animations on. There's a concept called tweening that we're going to look at more, which is basically taking a start and an ending frame and automatically building the frames in between it. I guess the opposite of tweening would be frame by frame, which means you're building the first frame, the second, the third, all the way to the last manually. And you're positioning everything in each frame and doing the manipulations all manually. Whereas tweening will do a lot of that for you. Keyframes are an important concept in animations, and we're going to look more in detail what keyframes are in just a little bit. We're also going to see how to save animations, what kind of formats you can save as, and exactly how do you save your animations so that you have your completed work that you can then use on the web or use as a movie. So to start with the timeline, which I mentioned briefly, this is a palette that appears at the bottom of Photoshop, and you can have multiple layers that you can do different kinds of editing on it. So it contains all of our animation work. We can do multiple visual layers and audio. So you can do audio with your timelines and inside your animations, just like you can with many other different photo editing or video editing tools. Tweening. This is a concept where it automatically adds frames between two frames, or two keyframes rather. They don't necessarily have to be keyframes, but a lot of the time they are keyframes. So let's say you've got a ball on frame 1 and you want to move this ball from left to right. So you create a frame 1, then you create a frame 2, and you move frame 2 to the end of your timeline, and you move your ball in frame 2 all the way to the right. So frame 2 now is really your ending frame. And when you tween, all the frames in between get filled automatically for you, and the position of the ball will move in each of those frames a little bit until it matches the ending frame. So that might look something like this. We start with this frame. We've got our ball on the left. Then we add this frame where we've got our ball on the right. Now imagine this ball has moved, and in your mind you can picture that moving from left to right. Well, that's what the tweening is going to do. It's going to add a frame, another frame, and you can see the ball is moving as each frame is added, and it's going to add all these frames in between until you get this smooth transition, and we didn't have to do anything for that to happen. So that is basically how tweening works. Now frame by frame is where you're creating and positioning each frame. This is a very manual process. We're not actually going to spend time on this or much time doing frame by frame. A lot of what we're going to do is using tweening. But if we look at the example again to see how this might work, we'll start with iframe 1, then we'll build a frame 2 and we'll position the ball in frame 2. We'll do a frame 3, then we'll move our ball over in frame 3. So you can see here everything is being done by hand, and we'll just keep building our frames until we get to the end. But again, this is not a process we're going to dive too much into, but if you have a sprite sheet, for example, that's where you might want to get involved with frame by frame. Keyframes are an important concept in animation. This is my definition of keyframes. Basically, you have a parameter within an animation that defines a specific action. So what that means is that one of your frames you're going to designate as a key point in your animation. So if you have, say, the tweening that we had earlier, you might move, instead of going all the way to the end of the timeline, you might move to the middle of the timeline. So that's now your last frame. But rather than having the ball continue from left to right, in that middle frame, you want to change the ball's opacity. So you'll set a keyframe that's now going to kick off an opacity change. Then you create another frame as your ending frame at the end of your timeline. You create another keyframe that changes the opacity back to its original. So that might look something like this. We start with our original frame, and we have our ball here on the left, so there's nothing different going on than what we've been doing. Then we get our next frame, and then now we're at our middle frame. And our middle frame is going to be a keyframe. So what we want here is to click a property within this layer in the timeline that we're going to say, okay, I'm going to start adjusting opacity, or maybe you're doing something else here, maybe changing the angle of movement. So when the next frame comes along and it fills automatically until we reach our ending frame, the opacity changes, and then on the ending frame we make it a keyframe and we change the opacity back. So these two keyframes are doing something different in the animation than what we started with. In frame 1 we started with just this ball, and then we added our middle frame and we let tweening add the frames in between. But in our middle frame we wanted to do something additional, and that was to change the opacity. And in the last frame we did something additional again, which was to change the opacity back. So that's what I mean by these parameters. The opacity is basically the parameter and we're adjusting it. So we're doing some action within the animation, and that's how we get these keyframes. Saving animations in Photoshop is very similar to saving a photo or an image. And you get, instead of getting a lot of photo options, you'll get video options. So you'll have options to save in HD. You can do 720, or rather 1080. You can do 720 and 1080. There's other different kinds of options for saving. You can do a QuickTime movie. You can save as a GIF. You can set transparency if that is built in, so that then you can export out your animation so that some of it is transparent, and you can use this in another video. So you get the same kind of transparency you might get when you save a PNG that also has transparency. So you can see there's a lot of familiarity in saving these animations as there is when you're saving an image or a photo.